My parents laughed when I walked into the seaside resort alone, taking my solitude as proof of my failure. They whispered that I could not even find a date for my sister's big day, but I did not drive 200 miles to prove my worth to them. I came to end a performance that had lasted 3 decades. Tonight, under these expensive lights, their perfect script is about to burn. My name is Marissa Cole, and as I stepped through the glass doors of the Sapphire Coast Resort, the first sound to greet me was the delicate, pitying chime of my mother's laughter. It was a sound I had memorized over 30 years, a specific frequency reserved for my failures. I walked alone, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the marble floor, cutting through the ambient string quartet music, to the guests milling about with their champagne flutes. I was just a woman attending a wedding without a +1. To my parents, standing near the entrance like gatekeepers of high society, my solitude was a punchline they had anticipated all week. She couldn't even find a date. I heard my father mutter to my uncle, his voice low but carried by the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling. At her age, you would think she would lower her standards just to save face. My mother smoothed the lapel of his tuxedo, her eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of triumph and faux concern. "Be nice." "Richard," she said, loud enough for me to hear. Marissa does not have Lila's charm. We have always known that. It was the narrative of our lives condensed into 10 seconds. Since we were children, Lila Cole was the protagonist, and I was the extra who accidentally wandered into the frame. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a report card full of straight A's, waiting for my father to look up from his newspaper. He never did. Yet, an hour later, when Lila came home with a participation ribbon from a gymnastics meet, she had nearly failed. My mother had baked a cake to celebrate her spirit. Marissa was stable, boring, and invisible. Lila was vibrant, fragile, and the center of their universe. Being stable meant I did not need attention. Being stable meant I was fine, and fine was enough. I handed my coat to the attendant and straightened my dress. It was a deep emerald silk, chosen specifically because it was a color Lila hated. My sister, the bride, was undoubtedly upstairs in the bridal suite, being preened and pampered by a team of stylists paid for with money my parents claimed they did not have when I needed tuition for grad school. But today was not about tuition, and it was not about the $3,000 I had spent on travel and accommodation just to be treated like a pariah. The ballroom was transforming into a stage. White roses cascaded from the ceiling, and crystal chandeliers caught the late afternoon light. It was a masterpiece of illusion, designed to make everyone believe that the Coles were a perfect, loving dynasty giving away their precious daughter. The perfection was suffocating. Every flower arrangement and every silk napkin was placed to hide the rifts in the foundation. They judged me for walking in alone, seeing it as a defect in my character. In their world, a woman without a man on her arm was a sentence with no punctuation, unfinished and confusing. "Marissa." My Aunt Ruth's voice came from the side, lacking the venom of the others. But I kept moving. I was not here to argue or to cry in the bathroom as I had done at my cousin's wedding 5 years ago. That version of me was dead. The silence I carried today was not the silence of the defeated. It was the silence of a predator waiting in the tall grass. For years, I had swallowed their insults and stored them in the pit of my stomach, letting them harden into something useful. They thought I was walking into the lion's den, defenseless, armed only with my solitude. They were wrong. I scanned the room, my gaze drifting over the sea of pastel dresses and expensive suits until I locked eyes with a man standing near the bar. He held a glass of sparkling water, looking out of place among the revelry. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, tapping his pocket once. It was the signal. I did not smile back. I simply turned my attention to the head table where my name card sat at the very edge, as far from the family center as possible. "You really should have brought someone. Anyone." My mother's voice drifted over as she approached me, her hand reaching out to adjust a strap on my dress that did not need adjusting. "It looks so sad, Marissa. But don't worry, We won't let it ruin Lila's pictures? I'm sure you won't, I replied, my voice steady. She blinked, surprised by the lack of defensive tremor in my tone. She did not know that the emptiness beside me was not a void. It was a space I had cleared for the truth, and the truth was heavy enough to crush this entire charade. My mother's dismissal of my solitude was not new. It was a precise echo of the day I brought home my acceptance letter to the state university, waving the thick envelope in the air with a pride I had not yet learned to suppress. I had studied until my eyes burned, foregoing parties and weekends to secure that spot. My father had glanced at the letter, taken a sip of his coffee, and shrugged. You have always been lucky with multiple choice questions. Marissa, he had said, not even looking me in the eye. Let's hope your luck holds out when you have to do real work. Luck? That was the label they slapped on every hour of my labor. If I won a science fair, the judges were lenient. If I got a promotion, the company must be desperate. Yet, when Lila failed 3 math classes in a row, it was never her fault. The teacher was biased, or the lighting in the classroom gave her migraines, or she was simply too creative for such rigid structures. Lila was the fragile porcelain doll that needed to be kept in a velvet box, protected from the harsh edges of reality. I was the packaging material, discarded once the prize was safe. The defining moment, the crack in the glass that never healed, happened the summer I turned 16. I had been selected for a prestigious journalism workshop in New York, a program that accepted only 20 students from the entire country. The fee was $500. I had saved half from babysitting, and my parents had promised the rest. But 2 days before the deadline, Lila came home in tears because she had not been invited to a classmate's sweet 16 party on a yacht. I remember standing in the living room, my acceptance letter crumpled in my fist, while my mother stroked Lila's hair. We are going to take you on a shopping spree. Honey, my mother cooed. We will buy you a dress that costs more than that entire party. You will look stunning. When I asked about the money for my workshop, my father sighed as if I were asking for a kidney. Marissa, look at your sister. She is devastated, he said, his voice dripping with that familiar, weaponized disappointment. We need to prioritize her mental health right now. The workshop is just extra. You can write in your room for free. Don't be selfish. Selfish. That was the word that snapped something inside me. I did not scream. I did not throw the vase that sat on the mantelpiece, though I wanted to. I simply stopped. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped looking for their approval. I retreated into the shadows of the hallway, watching them comfort the girl who had everything, while I lost the one thing I had built for myself. I realized then that in the theater of the Cole family, Lila was the heroine. My parents were the directors, and I was the antagonist whose only purpose was to create obstacles for them to overcome. It was Aunt Ruth who found me later that evening, sitting on the back porch, staring blankly at the dark tree line. Ruth was my father's older sister, a woman who wore sharp blazers and never dyed her graying hair. She sat down beside me, lighting a cigarette with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. They won't change, you know, Ruth said, exhaling a plume of smoke. You're waiting for them to wake up and see you. They won't. It's not fair, I whispered, my voice breaking. Ruth turned to me, her eyes hard and clear. Fair is a fairy tale for children. The real world runs on leverage. You are crying because you think they care about your feelings. They don't. They care about their image. She tapped a long fingernail against the wooden railing. Stop crying. Marissa. Tears dry up. Evidence does not. If you want to survive this family, stop feeling and start recording. Keep every letter. Remember every slight. One day, the bill will come due. That night, I stopped being a victim and became an archivist. I dried my eyes and started a journal. Over the years, the journal became a folder, and the folder became a hard drive. Standing now at the edge of Lila's wedding reception watching the same dynamic play out under expensive chandeliers. I felt a cold sense of gratitude toward Aunt Ruth. She had taught me that anger was a waste of energy unless it was forged into a weapon. My parents thought I was standing here helpless, stripping me of my dignity by mocking my single status. They did not know that I was not here to participate in their play. I was here to review the final act. I took a sip of my water, my hand perfectly steady. The time for crying was over. The time for the bill collection had arrived. I escaped the suffocating gravity of my family by burying myself in data. By the time I was 26, I had secured a senior analyst position at Northline Analytics, a private research firm in Chicago. It was a world of cold, hard facts, where emotions were irrelevant and performance was the only metric that mattered. I worked 60 hours a week, analyzing market trends and consumer behavior, finding comfort in the certainty of numbers. My salary was substantial, enough to buy a condo overlooking the lake, and more importantly, enough to buy my independence. However, distance did not stop my parents from rewriting my reality. To their social circle, my career was merely a convenient footnote. When they boasted about us, Lila was the star, a lifestyle consultant whose business model consisted entirely of posting filtered photos of brunch on social media. My parents funded her lifestyle while telling their friends that she was building a digital empire. As for me, my success was used as a background prop. "Marissa is very corporate," my mother would say with a dismissive wave of her hand. "She pays her own bills, which is nice, but she lacks Lila's creative spirit." They loved the fact that I was financially self-sufficient because it meant they could funnel all their resources into Lila without guilt. The dynamic shifted from annoying to criminal on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I received a call at my office from a leasing agent in our hometown. "Miss Cole, we are calling to verify your employment details regarding the lease application for the penthouse suite," the woman said cheerfully. "Since you are listed as the primary guarantor, we just need to confirm your annual income." I froze, my hand gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. I had never spoken to this woman. I had never agreed to sign a lease. I think there has been a mistake," I said, forcing my voice to remain even. "Who submitted this application?" "Your father, Richard Cole. He submitted the paperwork this morning with your signature. My parents had forged my name. They wanted to secure a luxury apartment for Lila and her fiancé to live in after the wedding, and they used my credit score to do it because theirs was likely ruined from years of funding Lila's whims." I did not scream. I did not call my parents to yell. Instead, I asked the agent to email me a copy of the application for my records, and then told her I would not be guaranteeing the lease. That document was the first piece of hard evidence I saved. From that day on, I became a silent observer. I archived every email where my mother asked for a temporary loan of $5,000 that was never repaid. I screenshotted text messages where they discussed how to manipulate me into paying for the catering. I built a digital fortress of their deceit. Meanwhile, the local media began the countdown to Lila's wedding. It was being hailed as the social event of the year. The glossy pages of the town's lifestyle magazine featured a 4-page spread on Lila, describing her as a philanthropic angel and her relationship as a fairy tale romance. The article failed to mention that the angel had been fired from 3 jobs for negligence, or that the fairy tale was being financed by debt and fraud. When the invitation arrived, it felt heavy in my hand. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering, inviting me to witness the coronation of the golden child. My initial instinct was to throw it in the trash. I had no desire to be a prop in their production again. Then my phone rang. It was Aunt Ruth. "You aren't going to skip it." "Are you?" she asked, her voice rough from years of smoking. "I have no reason to go." "Ruth, I'm done with them. I have enough evidence to cut them off legally if they try to use my name again." "Marissa." "Listen to me," Ruth said, her tone dropping lower. "If you stay home, you let them tell the story. They will tell everyone you were too jealous to show up. They will paint you as the bitter spinster sister, don't miss the final stage. You have the ammunition. Now you need the platform. I looked at the invitation again. Ruth was right. Silence was safe, but it was not justice. If I wanted to break the cycle, I had to do it where they could not hide the debris. I decided to attend not as a guest, but as a strategist executing a final maneuver. I RSVP'd for one. I was going to the wedding. The reception hall was a masterclass in passive-aggressive architecture. I found my seat at table 19, located so close to the swinging kitchen doors that I could smell the industrial dish soap and hear the waiters arguing about overtime, while the rest of the immediate family sat at the dais, bathed in golden spotlight. I was relegated to the periphery, seated next to a second cousin who had not spoken a sober word since 1999 and a former neighbor who kept asking why I was not a bridesmaid. My father stopped by my table during the salad course, not to check on me, but to ensure I understood my place in the hierarchy. "It is a shame you are so far back, Marissa," he said, adjusting his cufflinks with a smirk that did not reach his eyes. "But we had to prioritize the VIP guests. You understand, Lila has always been the one people come to see. She is just luckier than you. Some people are born with gravity, and some are just satellites. I am perfectly comfortable here, Dad," I replied, cutting a piece of cucumber with surgical precision. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "Just try not to make a scene." "Okay, we know how emotional you get when Lila succeeds." I watched him walk away, patting backs and shaking hands. The benevolent patriarch. He had no idea that the man sitting 2 tables away, nursing a club soda, was Evan Brooks. Evan was an old college friend who now worked as a senior producer for a major news network. He was not here for the free cake. He was here because I had asked him to document the truth. Under the table, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Evan. He had confirmed that the audio feed was clear and he had successfully bypassed the firewall for the projector system. The trap my parents had set was becoming obvious. I noticed the wedding coordinator, a nervous woman with a headset constantly glancing in my direction. I saw my mother whispering to the DJ, pointing a manicured finger at me. They were not ignoring me. They were targeting me. They intended to pull me onto the stage unprepared, hand me a microphone, and wait for me to stutter or cry. They wanted a public display of my jealousy to validate their treatment of me. If I crumbled, they would be the long-suffering parents of a difficult daughter. If I lashed out, they would be the victims. "You look like you are plotting a murder," Evan whispered as he walked past my chair on his way to the bar, his voice barely audible over the music. "Not a murder," I murmured, keeping my eyes on the head table where Lila was laughing at something her new husband whispered. "Just a correction." I saw the signs everywhere. The way the photographer angled his camera away from me unless I looked isolated. The way my mother had loudly asked if I had taken my medication earlier in the lobby, despite the fact that I took no medication. They were building a case against my sanity in real time. They needed a scapegoat in case the cracks in their financial facade started to show, and I was the designated villain. I remained still. I ate my dinner. I smiled politely at the drunk cousin. Inside, the tension was coiling like a spring. I watched my mother signal the master of ceremonies. The lights dimmed slightly. The air in the room shifted. They were about to make their move, confident that I was the same helpless girl who had cried over a rejection letter 15 years ago. They thought they were holding the gun, but they did not realize I had already emptied the chamber. The pieces were locking together. The stage was theirs, but the script was about to become mine. I slipped away from table 19 under the pretense of finding a restroom, but my destination was the service corridor behind the main stage. I had noticed my father and the wedding coordinator disappearing behind the velvet curtain moments ago, their body language urgent and conspiratorial. I pressed my back against the cold concrete wall, hidden by a stack of unused chairs, and held my breath. The acoustics here were perfect, carrying their voices directly to me. "We need the timing to be exact," my father was saying, his voice sharp. "When the speeches begin, you announce Marissa. Just say it is a surprise toast from the sister of the bride." "But sir, she isn't on the list," the coordinator replied, sounding hesitant. If she isn't prepared, it could be awkward. That is the point, my mother interjected, her tone dripping with ice. Marissa gets flustered easily. She will stammer. She will look jealous. And she will probably say something inappropriate about Lila. That is what we want. We need the room to sympathize with Lila having to deal with such a difficult sibling. It makes Lila look like a saint for inviting her. My hand did not shake as I slid my phone from my clutch and pressed the record button. I captured every word of their strategy. They were not just hoping I would fail, they were engineering a public execution of my character to insulate themselves from any future claims I might make against them. If I was established as the unstable sister tonight, any evidence I released later would be dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. I stopped the recording and saved the file to the cloud immediately. This was not a new tactic. I realized then that the narrative of my clumsiness and bad temper throughout my childhood had likely been manufactured with the same precision. Every time I was blamed for breaking a vase, Lila had dropped, or punished for making Lila cry when I refused to do her homework. It was practiced for this moment. I walked back toward the ballroom, my phone vibrating in my palm. It was a text from Evan. I have the audio file you just uploaded. The projector is linked to my tablet. We are ready when you are. Just say the word. I stopped at the edge of the room, looking at the exit signs glowing a soft red in the distance. The desire to run was physical, a tightening in my chest that urged me to flee to the parking lot and drive until the coast was just a line on a map. I could leave. I could let them have their petty victory, go back to my condo, and live my life in peace. But then a memory clawed its way to the surface. I was 18, packing my bags for college. My mother had come into my room, not to say goodbye, but to ask me to leave my car keys for Lila. When I refused, she had looked at me with a profound sadness and said, I just hope you find someone who can love you despite your selfishness. Marissa, it must be so lonely being you. That sentence had haunted me for 10 years, making me question my own worthiness of love. They had used my empathy as a leash. If I walked away now, I was accepting their definition of me. I was accepting that I was the broken one. I looked at the head table. Lila was beaming, unaware that her pedestal was built on quicksand. My parents were raising their glasses, confident in their control. I took a deep breath, smoothing the silk of my dress. I was not leaving. I typed a single word to Evan Go. I stepped back into the light, moving not toward the exit, but toward the stage. The detective work was done. The trial was about to begin. The heavy bass of the dance music faded, replaced by the sharp, high-pitched feedback of the microphone. The master of ceremonies, clearly reading from a note card my mother had slipped him only minutes before, beamed at the crowd with a plastic smile. Ladies and gentlemen, before we open the dance floor, we have a special impromptu moment. The bride's sister, Marissa, has been begging to share a few words of love with the happy couple. The ambush was executed with military precision. The spotlight swung violently across the room, blinding me for a second before settling on my face. A ripple of confused applause broke out, polite but hesitant. At the head table, my father covered his mouth with a linen napkin to hide his smirk, and my mother widened her eyes in a performance of maternal anxiety, silently broadcasting to the room that I was a ticking time bomb. They expected me to freeze. They expected the stammering, the flushed skin, the awkward silence that would confirm I was the jealous, socially inept sister they had described to everyone. I stood up slowly. I did not trip. I did not tremble. I walked to the stage with the measured pace of an executioner climbing the scaffold. The silence in the room was thick, a suffocating blanket of anticipation. When I took the microphone from the MC, he looked surprised by the steadiness of my hand. I looked down at my parents. They were leaning forward, eager for the breakdown. They wanted the tragedy. Thank you, I said, my voice clear and amplified, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. My parents always say that Lila is the heart of this family. And they are right. Because the heart requires blood to pump, and someone has to bleed to keep it beating. The smile faltered on my mother's face. The guests shifted in their seats, the sound of silk rustling against silk echoing in the quiet hall. I wanted to tell a story about generosity. I continued, locking eyes with my father, like the time I was told there was no money for my graduate school tuition because the family was going through a hard time. I worked 3 jobs. I thought we were all making sacrifices. That is what families do, right? They share the burden. I paused. The air in the room was so thin it was hard to breathe. The staff had stopped moving. The bartenders were staring. But then I found out that sacrifice in the Cole family is a one-way street, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. I found out that the $20,000 that was not available for my education was actually used to pay off a settlement for a car accident Lila caused while driving under the influence. An accident that was scrubbed from the police records. A collective gasp tore through the room. My father shot up from his chair, his face turning a violent shade of red. "Marissa!" "That is enough," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic, but he was not wearing a microphone. And I was. "Sit down, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his protest like a razor. "I am not finished. You wanted a toast. You wanted me to speak. So I am speaking." My mother was now clawing at my father's arm, her composure shattered. She signaled frantically to the coordinator to cut the sound, but the coordinator was frozen, staring at me in shock. The guests were paralyzed, caught between the horror of the scene and the hunger to hear the rest. I looked toward the back of the room where Evan stood by the audio-visual booth. He gave me a sharp thumbs up. "You see, I recently learned that my value to this family is not as a daughter, but as a credit line," I said into the silence. I learned that my signature is apparently a communal asset that can be used without my consent. "Marissa, stop this." "Please," Lila whispered from the head table, her face pale, her eyes darting around the room in confusion. "I can't stop. Lila." "It is too late for that," I replied, turning to face the crowd. "Evan, please show them what love looks like in the Cole household." Before my father could rush the stage, the massive projection screen behind the bride and groom flickered to life. The time for whispers was over. The time for the truth had begun. The screen behind me exploded with light, dwarfing the wedding cake and the floral arrangements. The first image was crystal clear, a lease agreement for a luxury penthouse in downtown Chicago, dated 2 weeks ago, magnified 10 feet tall. The bottom of the page showed a signature that read, "Marissa Cole," but the handwriting was jagged, hesitant, and unmistakably belonging to my father. "What is that?" a guest in the front row whispered, the sound carrying in the dead silence. I pointed to the screen without looking back. "That is a lease for $4,500 a month. A lease that my parents told Lila was a wedding gift paid for by their investment dividends. In reality, it is a legally binding contract under my name, using my social security number, without my knowledge." The slide changed. This time, it was a chain of text messages between my mother and father. The timestamps were from last month. "Mother, Lila needs the deposit by Friday." The bank rejected us again. "Father, use Marissa's info. She has the credit score. We will tell her later, or just pay it if we can." Mother, "She will be furious." Father, "She is family. She owes us." The collective gasp from the room was not polite this time. It was visceral. It was the sound of 100 wealthy, respectable people realizing they were witnessing a crime. Lila stood up slowly, her napkin falling to the floor. She looked at the screen, then at our parents, her face draining of color until she looked like a ghost in lace. You told me the investments paid out," Lila stammered, her voice trembling. You said we were safe. We were protecting you." My mother shrieked, standing up and knocking over her wine glass. Red liquid spilled across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. "Lila, baby, don't listen to her. She is twisting everything we did what we had to do to give you the life you deserve. By stealing my identity, I asked calmly. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The facts were screaming for me. And it is not just the apartment. The catering today. The $30,000 for the venue charged to a credit card opened in my name 3 months ago. I brought the statements. I signaled Evan again. The screen shifted to a montage of bank statements, credit card applications, and denied loan requests from my parents. It was an autopsy of their financial ruin, laid bare for their country club friends to see. The illusion of the wealthy, benevolent Cole family disintegrated in seconds, replaced by the reality of two desperate grifters exploiting their own children. "Turn it off, Richard. Do something," my mother screamed, looking around wildly as if she could physically grab the light and stuff it back into the box. My father lunged toward the AV booth, but two of the groomsmen stepped in his path, their faces grim. They were not protecting him. They were blocking him. The room was no longer on their side. "You lied to me," Lila whispered, the realization hitting her harder than any physical blow could. She turned to our father, her eyes filling with tears. "You made me thank her for a blender. You made me think she was cheap because she only bought me a blender, while you were stealing thousands from her to pay for my dress. It is complicated." "Lila," my father yelled, sweat beading on his forehead. "We are a family. We share. Marissa has plenty. She doesn't need it like you do. I am not an ATM." "Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his protest like a razor. "And Lila is not a pet you can keep in a golden cage built on fraud." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. There was no music, no clinking of glasses, only the hum of the projector fan and the ragged breathing of my parents. The perfect portrait was slashed. The guests stared at my parents, not with admiration, but with the cold, detached judgment of a jury that had just heard the final verdict. I stood center stage, not triumphant, but hollowed out. I had burned the script, and for the first time in my life, everyone was looking at the reality, not the performance. Lila did not scream. She did not faint or throw the tantrum my parents had likely anticipated. Instead, she stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the screen where the evidence of our parents' betrayal still glowed in high definition. Then, she looked at her husband, a man who seemed to shrink under the weight of the revelation, and she slowly removed her hand from his arm. It was a small gesture, but it signaled a seismic shift. She turned to our parents, her face stripped of all the bridal joy, leaving only a cold, hard realization. "Lila, honey, please," my mother whimpered, reaching out a hand that trembled violently. "We can explain. We did this for you. We just wanted you to have the best start." Lila stepped back, avoiding her touch as if it were contagious. "You didn't do this for me," she said, her voice shaking but distinct. "You did this so you could play dress-up with my life. You made me a thief." Without another word, Lila turned and walked off the stage. She did not run. She walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, heading not toward the bridal suite, but toward the side exit leading to the parking lot. I watched her go. A part of me wanted to chase her, to offer the comfort I had always given when we were children, but I stayed rooted to the spot. I knew that if I went to her now, I would just be another crutch. Lila needed to walk on her own broken legs if she was ever going to learn how to stand. In the ballroom, the social tide turned with brutal speed. The guests, the elite of the town who prized reputation above oxygen, began to physically distance themselves from the head table. It was like watching a receding tide. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood up, gathering their purses and coats. My father looked around, his eyes wide with panic, searching for an ally. "Bob, surely you don't believe this?" My father stammered to his golf partner in the front row. It is just a misunderstanding. You know how girls get. It is just drama." Bob did not answer. He simply placed a hand on his wife's back and guided her toward the door. turning his back on my father completely. Then, Aunt Ruth stepped out from the shadows near the bar. She walked with a heavy, deliberate cadence, the sound of her cane striking the floor, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. She stopped directly in front of the dais, looking up at her brother. "It is not drama." "Richard," Ruth said, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "It is fraud. I warned you 10 years ago that I would not cover for you again. I saw the forged trust fund documents. I saw what you did to Marissa's savings account when she was 18. "Ruth! Don't!" my mother hissed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her professional makeup. "We are family. That is the only reason I didn't call the police myself," Ruth replied, her tone final. "But Marissa has done the right thing. It is over." The confirmation from the family matriarch was the final blow. My parents slumped in their chairs, shrinking into themselves as the room emptied of sympathy. They sat alone on the stage they had built, surrounded by the wreckage of their own lies. I stood there for a moment, waiting for the rush of victory. I expected to feel a surge of adrenaline, a vindictive thrill at seeing them brought low. But there was no joy. There was no laughter. Instead, a profound, quiet relief washed over me. It was the feeling of putting down a heavy load I had been carrying for 3 decades. The script was burned. The roles were dissolved. I was no longer the villain, and they were no longer the directors. I did not say anything else. There was nothing left to say. The truth was suspended in the air, heavy and undeniable. I turned my back on the stage, on the weeping mother and the defeated father, and walked down the center aisle. The guests parted for me, their eyes wide, whispering behind their hands. But I did not look at them. I did not look for Evan. I simply walked toward the double doors at the back of the room, pushing them open into the cool, dark corridor. For the first time in my life, I was walking away not because I was cast out, but because I chose to leave. The salt air of the Pacific hit my face like a cold towel, scrubbing away the stale heat of the ballroom. I stood on the stone balcony overlooking the cliffs, my hands gripping the rough iron railing. Behind me, the glass doors were shut, muffling the chaotic sounds of the implosion I had just engineered. The shouting, the crying, and the frantic accusations sounded distant, like a radio play left running in an empty house. For the first time in my life, the drama of the Cole family was happening without me. I was no longer the audience, nor the stagehand, nor the prop. I was outside the theater entirely. The heavy glass door slid open with a soft hiss, and Evan stepped out. He loosened his tie, looking exhausted but exhilarated. He joined me at the railing, staring out at the dark water where the moonlight cut a silver path through the waves. "Well," Evan said, exhaling a long breath. "That was nuclear. I think I saw your uncle trying to sneak out through the kitchen." I let out a short, dry laugh. He always did hate confrontation. Evan turned to face me, his expression sobering. He studied my profile in the dim light. "Do you regret it? I mean, really, there is no going back from this. Marissa. They will never forgive you." I looked down at the crashing waves below. I thought about his question carefully. I thought about the little girl who used to hide her report cards because she knew they would be ignored. I thought about the woman who ate ramen for a month to pay for a sister's mistake. I thought about the desperate, gnawing hunger I had carried for 30 years, the hunger for them to look at me and see something other than a utility. "I don't regret it," I said, my voice steady against the wind. "For years, I thought that if I just worked harder, if I was just better, they would finally give me a seat at the table. I thought their love was a prize I hadn't earned yet." I looked up at Evan. But tonight, I realized the table was never set for me. I was just the one paying for the food. "You are free now," Evan said softly. "Yes," I whispered. "I am." The realization settled over me, not with a bang, but with a quiet, structural shift. The validation I had been chasing was worthless. My parents were not the arbiters of my worth. They were barely managing their own crumbling reality. Their approval was counterfeit currency, and I had bankrupted myself trying to collect it. I turned away from the railing and looked back at the resort. The lights of the ballroom were still blazing, a golden cage I had finally unlocked. I saw my future stretching out, not as a lonely path, but as an open field. I could buy a house that no one would try to steal. I could date a man without worrying if my family would chase him away or exploit him. I could succeed without apology. I am leaving, I said, straightening up. I have a red-eye flight to catch in 3 hours. I need to be back in Chicago by morning. You aren't going to stay to see the fallout? Evan asked, raising an eyebrow. It is going to be spectacular. No, I replied. The fallout is their story. I am done writing it for them. I checked my watch. It was 11 o'clock. The night was still young for them, a long night of explanations and shame. But for me, the night was over. I was tired, but it was the good, clean fatigue of a job finished. Thank you. Evan, I said, placing a hand on his arm. Send me the bill for your services. I can actually afford it. On the house? He smiled. For the show? I turned and walked toward the side stairs that led down to the parking lot, bypassing the lobby entirely. I did not look back at the balcony. I did not look back at the ballroom. My heels clicked on the pavement, a steady, rhythmic sound that felt like a heartbeat. I was walking into the dark, but everything felt incredibly bright. My tires crunched over the gravel of the resort driveway, a sound that felt like the final period at the end of a long, run-on sentence. I did not wait for the valet to fetch my car. I walked to the lot, unlocked the door, and threw my clutch onto the passenger seat. As I merged onto the highway, the Sapphire Coast Resort was nothing more than a cluster of lights in my rearview mirror. I watched it shrink until the road curved, and then it was gone. I did not feel the urge to turn around. By the time I reached my condo in Chicago, the shock waves of my revelation had already begun to dismantle my parents' social standing. In their circle, financial ruin was forgivable, but public fraud was a cardinal sin. The gossip traveled faster than fiber optics. By Monday morning, my father had been asked to step down from the board of the local country club. By Wednesday, the bank had frozen their assets pending an investigation into the identity theft allegations I had substantiated with the documents I left on the projector. They were not just embarrassed. They were exposed as predators who had fed on their own children. I did not block their numbers, but I did not answer their calls. I watched the notifications roll in voicemails from my mother oscillating between rage and begging, missed calls from my father that grew less frequent as the reality of his legal situation set in. They were facing potential criminal charges for the credit card fraud, and for the first time in their lives, they could not charm or bribe their way out of the consequences. They were alone in the mess they had created. A week later, I received a single text message from Lila. I expected a tirade. I expected her to blame me for ruining her special day. Instead, the screen read, I left him. I am moving to Denver. Don't look for me. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the years of favoritism she had benefited from. But there was also no defense of our parents. Lila was finally being forced to navigate the world without a safety net. And while part of me worried for her, a larger part of me knew this was necessary. She had been a character in our parents' fiction for too long. Now, she had to learn how to be a person. I deleted the thread without replying. Her journey was hers to walk, just as mine was mine. I returned to Northline Analytics with a renewed sense of purpose. I no longer downplayed my bonuses or hid my promotions to avoid outshining my sister. When I closed a major deal with a pharmaceutical client 2 months later, I bought a bottle of vintage champagne and celebrated with my friends. I did not send a picture to my family group chat. I did not need their validation to know the champagne tasted good. Revenge is often romanticized as a chaotic, fiery act of destruction. People think of screaming matches and slashed tires, but true revenge, the kind that heals, is simply the restoration of truth. I did not destroy my family. I merely removed the shadows they had used to hide their rot. I let the light in, and the structure collapsed because it was never built to withstand reality. I stood in my living room one evening, looking out at the city skyline. The reflection in the glass showed a woman who was tired, yes, but whole. I was no longer the extra in the background. I was no longer the bank. I was Marissa Cole, and for the first time, that name belonged entirely to me. I turned away from the window, picked up my keys, and walked out the door to meet Evan for dinner. I did not look back at the empty apartment. I simply walked forward into the rest of my life. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you guys are tuning in from. So drop a comment down below and let's get a conversation started. I read as many as I can if you enjoyed seeing the truth finally come to light. Please give this video a like, subscribe to Victoria Revenge Stories for more satisfying deep dives into real-life drama, and be sure to hit that hype button to help the story get heard by even more people. See you in the next one.